Welcome to the show that we do every once in a while. It is the post BNR chat, talk, discussion. Busting out the thesaurus this morning because we are going to talk about a bunch of different cards in a bunch of different formats. So we're going to use a bunch of different words to do so in order to talk about everything that happened in the monumental BNR announcement that went up yesterday, which, by the way, if you haven't read it, dailymtg.com. Or you can just stick around. We're going to talk about all of it. Joining me today, Carmen and Dan from the studio are going to talk about all of it. We're going to talk about every card. We're going to talk about every decision. We're going to talk about cards that were on the list, aren't on the list. We're going to respond to a number of questions and thoughts and feedback that we saw online. And then we will have a Q&A session at the end where you can put your questions in chat. Hold on that till we get there. I may write some down, but you're best getting noticed if you wait till we get to that Q&A session. So we are going to just kick things off and start going through the list, format by format. So Carmen, we're going to start with you and probably the most discussed format, which is Modern. So we made two bands in Modern. So let's start, Carmen, by talking about these two cards and what the discussion was like around this.
Sure. So just jumping right into it, Nadu Winged Wisdom is a card that had a lot of problems going on with it, right? This is a card that was generally too strong in tournament play. It had a target on its back going into Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3 just a month or so ago. And in spite of that, was able to put up almost a 60% win rate, ended up winning the tournament in the very end. It also had a bunch of logistical tournament issues. Mm-hmm. This is a deck that the technical strongest version of it didn't actually play a sort of specific win con where all that card is trying to do is win the game. It instead could present a really complicated loop where you technically make infinite creatures, hard to represent.
Yep.
And then it would draw its deck an infinite number of times and be able to get out of any situation. So this resulted in a lot of paper tournaments seeing a lot of time in the round just go half an hour or so over. Just a nightmare for tournament organizers and players alike. Really easy to go ahead and just show this one to the door of Modern. Grief, on the other hand, it's a little more complicated. It's one that wasn't necessarily showing up in the numbers that we've seen it show up for the last year and change. Mm-hmm. It did end up winning Pro Tour Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
We saw these Black Red Evoke decks put up really strong numbers, a lot of competitive win rates for a very long time until this Nadu deck sort of ended up pushing the quote-unquote scam draw to be a bit less powerful and reliable than it used to be. And it's something where once we decide to pull Nadu back out of the format, we expected that this would end up coming back in a really big way, but we've seen in a bunch of different formats, another we'll cover later, that players don't really think Grief on the whole is that fun of an experience to preserve, and we decided to go ahead and just remove that one from Modern at the same time.
Now, Dan, I think Grief speaks towards some of the larger philosophy that we look at when we go through these BNR discussions, because as Carmen said, it wasn't seeing nearly the play that it was before, even if the complaints were still pretty high. So talk a little bit more about the philosophy behind that.
Yeah, I don't think Grief is particularly fun. I know that we designed it, we put it into the format, and fun is an important thing we weigh about when we're making changes to a format. We want you to have fun playing the format. It is true that it's been on the decline for a while. It's not in any of the top most represented decks in the format. Part of our decision was Nadu is such a large shadow looming over the format that we are trying to. We assume once it's gone, people can react in a bunch of different ways. But one of those ways could be that Grief comes back into the forefront and we have similar feelings to what people felt during Black Red's reign. It's not a for sure thing, but at the same time, we took action against the Black Red Evoke deck. We killed Fury. Perhaps it could be said maybe Grief's time was up a few BNR announcements ago, and it wasn't just clear enough for us to do. So while it's not super played, the its presence isn't of that of Nadu or even other cards. We really think people are tired of just starting the game at 5 cards. It won't happen as much as it used to, but still, you come to play Magic, you come to cast spells. Also, just like, if it didn't, again, this is our fault, but if it didn't cost 0 mana, or 0 mana plus a card that costs 1 mana, maybe it'd be more reasonable if it was cast on 3 or 4 mana, like other cards that we have left legal.
Now, sort of to some of the points you mentioned in there, you know, it wasn't fun, but it wasn't ubiquitous. Let's go to the other end of that scale, to a card that's ubiquitous, and maybe this is a question for you, Carmen, but a lot of people noted that the One Ring is the most played card in Modern, or you know, up in that top
Arid
2.
Mesa is the most.
Arid Mesa, okay.
Then the
maybe the most
It's
played non.
due, right? Scalding Tarn, Polluted Delta, we've seen these be the most played cards so many times. Arid Mesa hasn't been the most played card in any format since like Zendikar Standard or something.
At any rate, the One Ring, if not the most played card, is certainly up there. Definitely a very powerful card. What was the discussion around the One Ring?
So this is one that I think the first time I ever sort of thought or heard about this framing was from Dave Humphreys, where I think a lot of people kind of think of ban and restricted list curation as always just following the data, looking to make a matchup grid that is perfect 50-50 all the way down. And that's something that doesn't really require game designers to do. You could just have a computer do something like that, and eventually everyone's fighting with grizzly bears.
Yeah.
What our job is to make sure that when people spend the time to play a format, they commit their weekend to going to an RCQ, they work really hard to seek out all the cards for that deck they've been building for a long time, that it's fun, that it's something that they want to do again and again. And the One Ring is something where it is omnipresent, but it's not clear to us that it's having a net negative impact on Modern. There are a lot of high resource sort of strategies that struggle to compete in Eternal formats. We see in Legacy, for example, low resource, Wasteland Days sort of gameplay is the big thing there.
Yeah.
Modern is trending that direction, just as you expand the card pool, efficiency is the strongest thing to do, and so on. The One Ring is something that is a massive pressure in the other direction, and we feel, at least for now, opens up a lot of gameplay to see that we kind of want to give it a chance to see if it's problematically strong.
Sure.
If it's strong, it is a really fun thing to be strong, and at the end of the day, something is going to be the strongest, so this is a bet we're comfortable taking, at least in the short term.
Okay. Speaking of short term, so I think we're going to talk about this throughout this, but Dan, we also changed the cadence of our BNR announcement, and that's in the text, but can you talk a little bit more about why we did that and how that's going to shift things?
Yeah, so in the world before today, we had a ban and restricted analysis cadence, announcement cadence, where, you know, sort of shooting the gap between a set's release and the next set's preview season, we would sort of make an evaluation on each format. You know, one thing that was important to analyze was the impact of the newest set on all the formats. Did everything go well? Is there any problems? And the problem with that, it's nice timing-wise for us, but it doesn't really let us see pressure events, all the pressure events that could exist. There's a, you know, we didn't ban any MH2 cards for quite a while, for better or worse, until we saw a Pro Tour where it was, you know, even a year later. Part of that reason, you know, maybe MH2 was really well balanced, but also there just wasn't a lot of competitive pressure at the time. So we believe that focusing the BNR announcements, you know, around the, you know, the most amount of tournaments we can to gather the most data and let players try and, you know, vet the cards and really show us that something is going to be a problem is more, will be more impactful, will help us make better educated decisions than, you know, that sort of 2 to 3 weeks after a set, did something break? We might not even know because the tournament didn't happen, or a series of tournaments didn't happen. So that is the impetus for changing. Yes, it means fewer BNR announcements. We'll have something like 3 to 4 depending on the year. Right now we have around, I think, 5 or 6 or something like that.
It's at least 6.
At least 6. but we don't use them all in terms of, I mean, we come on, we write an article and do a show, and we do meet, but sometimes things just don't need to be, we don't believe things have happened, or we just feel like we don't have enough information and we want to see something play out. So I think, all in all, it will be a similar amount of change than that we had in the past.
Okay.
And so, yeah, part of, it said in the article, December 16th is the next BNR window, and that is at the conclusion of the current sort of RCQs, NRCs that are in Pioneer and Modern. But we're willing to make changes in all the formats. I mean, this happens after 3 Eternal Weekends as well, and so I'm sure we'll analyze Legacy and Vintage after the changes. And yeah.
And that's a good point. The timing is going to be tied to the RCQ or the RC and RCQ seasons. Those are the ones that we control. We have the longest view of. That doesn't mean they won't interfere with other large tournaments occasionally.
Occasionally, yeah.
Occasionally they might, but we know the RCQ seasons are long. They involve a lot of different tournaments, and so those are the ones we're focused on.
Yeah, we cannot avoid every single event on the worldwide calendar.
Yeah.
It's just, there's a lot of Magic getting played, but we can at least try for the most.
Yep.
I think this hits that.
Now let's stick with Modern. We also saw a lot of conversation about Boros Energy. We know Boros Energy has shown itself, Modern is not a format on Arena, but it's shown itself to be really powerful and historic. It's shown itself to even be powerful enough for Timeless. Even in the Nadu world, it was seeing play in Modern. So what are your all thoughts on the Boros Energy deck?
So in general, this is a deck that we know is winning a lot and is something that actually could hang in Nadu, the Nadu world rather. Something that is less clear to us is how much Nadu was pushing out of the format, right?
Yeah.
It's really easy to say, Nadu is 20% of the format or whatever the specific number is, but it isn't clear once you remove that 20% block how that ends up spreading out against the rest of the format. We think that it's possible there are things that could end up pushing Boros Energy out that could not beat Nadu, so you weren't allowed to register in a competitive event. Or even if you did, you're not making a very deep run because you probably get clobbered somewhere by Nadu along the way.
Yep.
And at least for now, I think it's something that largely encourages interactive gameplay, goes a little bit longer. You're not feeling like the game is over on the first or second turn of the game. It's the sort of thing that at least for now we want to see it play out a little bit more in the real world.
Makes sense. All right, let's move on. And if you have more thoughts, questions about Modern, great. We're going to come back to those in the Q&A session. I know Modern was likely the most talked about format online. But second was Pioneer. And Pioneer, we made some pretty big changes as well. Amalia removes the most popular combo deck, and Soren removes the most popular, still kind of almost a combo deck.
Yeah, it's show and tell. Come on, it's still a combo.
Show and tell combo. It's still a
If I learned
combo.
anything from this slide, vampires, we got to tone down a
Vampires,
little bit.
overpowered. Yep.
Who even knew Molly was a vampire? No.
Okay, so Dan, talk about these changes in Pioneer.
For sure. So, again, at the Pro Tour won by Simon Nielsen, the Pioneer Pro Tour. That's wrong. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Simon wins.
Yeah, that's
you,
true.
like,
It actually is difficult.
Throw a dart at the calendar, find a Pro Tour.
was-
Simon might have
Simon
won it or been in the top 8.
won with Nadu too, didn't he?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm recalling the Pro Tour top 8 that has Chris Larson and Simon Nielsen playing 7-ish games in a 5-round.
Yes. Yeah, where they were
top 8?
teammates and they drew several of the games.
Yes. That's not ideal.
Tournament organizers hate it.
At least it was in the top 8, but I'm sure it happened outside of that as well.
Yep.
So anyway,
Seth won that PT, but
Thank you.
yes, it was Simon in the top 8. I think he was playing the heroic deck.
the
Yeah.
deck that can target the opponent's
Yeah.
cards and make them indestructible. So
Yes.
there's a host of issues with the Amalia deck. One of which is the logistical one that I'm trying to remember, and there's just a sort of a bug on Amalia that we didn't catch in design. Didn't think it was going to matter a ton, but apparently it has, and it's just causing sort of how Nadu causes really long round times. Amalia can do the same thing. It's a nightmare to click through on the internet if you're playing on Magic Online. And its win rate is strong. The deck is super resilient. It's got its core combo. It's got many ways to find each of them and rebuy them from the graveyard. And so it's just too consistent, too strong, and logistically not ideal. So for that reason, we decided to take action against Amalia. Yeah, we considered other cards in the deck. People have talked about Wild Growth Walker, but I think you hit the card that has the mistake on it or has the interaction we missed on it, and just move on from there. We don't think we really are interested in weaker Amalia decks, if that's even possible.
It has like the Nadu problem, right, where it's really easy for us to ban it because it's way too strong. And balance is a tool that we use to the end of fostering fun environments that people can keep coming back and playing. But also it does have that logistical nightmare aspect where it's like, well, what if this happened less? It's like, well, it only takes one person going 20 minutes over forever, the entire tournament to have to just go, all right, well, I should have gone and got a sandwich. Why did I spend my weekend doing this? And we really don't want that.
Yeah, for sure. On the Sorin side, Black-Red Vampires, when Seth Manfield broke it out at the Pro Tour MKM, it has just grown in popularity. You know, we like when these new decks win tournaments. That's really awesome. A new card from the newest set props up this strategy, and all of a sudden a team gets this great feeling, or even a single player, where they innovated enough to win a tournament. That's such a great feeling in Magic. So we didn't feel the need to react immediately to that event. But over time, as we watched seasons of RCs happen, it's just grown in popularity. It's the most played deck in Pioneer. It's got a great win rate. We considered, multiple cards in this deck, but sort of as I alluded to in the article, it's just such a high stakes turn, especially on the play, when you can spend 3 mana, put a 6 mana card into play. You still have the 3 mana card in play. If they are fortunate enough to have the right combination of a creature in play plus a removal spell to answer the Vein Ripper, there's still a Sorin in play, and you spent so many resources.
The Oath of the Gatewatch card, Tears of Valakut, you can have exactly that card.
There are some niche cards that aren't really good in any other situations, or you could be a deck playing like Supreme Verdict or whatever, but still that's after the fact, and the deck has Thoughtseize, so
and they have a Planeswalker after your Wrath has resolved.
Right. Doesn't feel great.
Out here.
Right. Again, we considered, should we hit Vein Ripper instead? But the problem seems to be the fact that you can play a more than 3 mana card on turn 3, especially with one that has such a strong protective ability. And I will assume we will make more vampires in the future. Who knows if they'll cost 6 or whatever? But vampire is a pretty beloved creature type, as we just kind of saw. Two leave the format. And then the last card we considered out of that was Fable the Mirror Breaker. That card has a lot of use cases. Oh, look, hello. Not just in the vampire deck, but among cool strategies. The Yorion deck and Enigmatic Incarnation. These kind of decks are pretty sweet. This is a very strong card. We've addressed it in other formats, but I think it gets to live on for now. It doesn't seem like the biggest pressure given by that deck involves this, although it does add a lot of consistency.
I mean, Fable the Mirror Breaker is the kind of card that's in the space of like the One Ring, which we were speaking to a little bit before, where if it does end up being strong, that maybe it's too strong and we have to do something about it later. But in the ways that it is strong are generally into encouraging you getting to play the game, which is really what we want out of most of our cards. And if there is a card that's going to be too strong, Fable of the Mirror Breaker is a really fun one.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of fun ones, at least in my opinion, Treasure Cruise is another card that has come up a lot in conversations about Pioneer. What was the discussion around this card? Yeah,
this was definitely third on our list. We have this BNR meeting, and we all talk through all the cards we think we might need to address, and yeah, this one came up quite a lot. It's always sort of been a card that we've considered when we're talking about Pioneer. It does happen to not be the biggest problem in the format a lot of the time. And so, part of the reason for not taking action against Treasure Cruise is we're taking 2 pretty big swings for the format. The top 2 most played decks are getting hit. Yes, Phoenix is, in the top 3 or 4 most played Pioneer decks. And yeah, we kind of felt that too much change, there's, don't change enough or change too much or change just right. And it's really hard to hit exactly the right target. It's important that we don't completely blow up all these formats, but that we address the clearest, most present issues. And so Treasure Cruise kind of fell short of that line. Yes, we could take out, people might not play Phoenix, people might, it's unclear. But I think just taking 3 top decks out of a format is just really fraught with error. Every sort of next card you consider, of which you're a little less confident, adds a certain amount of error bars to the total decision. And we're content with, yes, maybe Phoenix is the strongest deck, maybe people go back to black-red mid-range, maybe they go to the black-red Saki deck. It's unclear what's going to happen. And because it's so unclear, we thought making, one more change would just be a bit too much.
Mm-hmm. There's also a degree where it's just a cool card, right? And there's nowhere else in Magic that you can play it. One of the actual first thing that got banned in Pioneer, this is before my time, but were the fetch lands,
right,
just because they end up warping a lot of things like
Yep.
Delve or Deathrite Shaman, which is banned in a lot of places, but not Pioneer. The cool thing about Pioneer is it not having those cards means that you get to play with really strong stuff like Treasure Cruise, and you can't get that experience anywhere else in Magic. And once we ban it, it's just kind of gone. So
Yeah.
I think really making sure that we're positive it needs to go. Like this is a good place to kind of spin that sort of capital.
Yeah,
Sure.
You can always play in Canadian Highlander.
Yeah, you can play one in Vintage as well, but that's a good point. There's
Find Blake on spell table.
I have to get my one reference to Canadian Highlander
It's fine.
in every
I'll
show.
build a deck.
Yeah.
I
I have 5. You can borrow one. Several of them have Treasure Cruise.
Okay, I think my
How many
11
points
is
does a
free.
Treasure Cruise
All right. Let's move on to Canadian Highlander for 60 card formats, which is Legacy. It kind of is. We made one change in Legacy. It's our old friend Grief. Carmen, talk about this one.
So Grief is one that I think most of the Legacy community has known is a little bit too strong for a while now. There hasn't been a great window to ban it before now, and this is a card that is so much stronger in Legacy than it is in a place like Modern. Mm-hmm. Normally in Modern, you need to already have your quote-unquote scam piece, your 1-mana way to recur the Grief, rolled up the turn that you go for the Grief, except now you get tools like Reanimate, which you're just able to do it on any turn. And then you get to back that up with sort of the Days Wasteland package that has been strong in Legacy for as long as it's been type 1.5, right? It's something that we really just needed to go ahead and get on out. I know there are some other cards that you probably want to talk about a little bit in there, but Grief is just such low-hanging fruit and was 30 to 40% of the format or something like that. Just like actual all-timer numbers for most omnipresent card outside of Wasteland or Brainstorm or what have you.
I know. For those of us who've been around the game for a long time, like the kind of numbers it was putting up in Legacy are like old Standard Affinity style numbers. Urza Saga Tolarian Academy style numbers where like we didn't ban things unless they were 30% of the format.
You were totally allowed to register other decks.
Yeah.
No one would even stop you. They would thank you.
You were allowed, but it wasn't a good idea. And that was kind of where this was in Legacy. But there were some other cards that we did want to talk about. And in that same sort of blue-black list, we've seen a lot of Psychic Frog in Legacy as well.
So Psychic Frog is one that is strong. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to pretend like we don't think that this is a strong card or something to that effect. And I know its ubiquity has been a pretty large talking point among prevalent community figures. It's really hard for us to disentangle how much of that is on the back of how strong the Grief package is, especially with blue cards. It just ends up being really free to play this card in so much of the format that it isn't clear to us. It is problematically strong. We know it's going to end up finding a home in fair Reanimator decks that end up still existing. Fair Reanimator's a little bit of a,
I get what you're saying.
We'll say more streamlined Reanimator decks after this. We also know that Delver is a very natural home for this sort of card, but at least for now, it's not clear to us that it's going to take up a metagame share that would denote a ban if it doesn't have something as strong as the Grief Reanimate package backing it up.
Is this, and given that the archetype had such a big metagame share, is this one you all are looking at closely for the next BNR window?
Yeah, this is one. I personally play a ton of the format. You can go through my social media posts and find a bunch of decks that I post and everything. And I think there are a lot of cards in the vein of Swords to Plowshares, for example, that it was much harder to justify playing in the face of all of these Grief decks that were able to just kill you so quickly. So I think in a world where you can afford to be a bit more reactive and not have to worry about powering through an Atraxa in 30% of your games or what have you, I'm a little optimistic that we're going to see its stock go down a bit, but I do think it is something that I would not be surprised if we had to take action against in the future.
All right. There were two other cards that were discussed. Let's look at another one we've visited before in other formats, Up the Beanstalk.
So Up the Beanstalk is just a card that is a massive card advantage engine whenever you get to start pairing it with high mana value free spells. Normally, the way to offset a card that you can cast for free, like Force of Will, like Solitude, etc., is to make it prohibitive to cast the normal way.
Yep.
Except this undoes the drawback of having to pitch another card to any of these cards and then super pays you if you bridge to the late game.
Yep.
On top of it replacing itself immediately, it's just the kind of thing that we already had to ban in Modern, and we're at least keeping an eye on it for now in Legacy. It's not clear that it's going to put up problematic numbers, but it's something that I think the community has mixed enough feelings on that if we're really doing our due diligence, we're kind of looking at all of it.
Yeah, and it's super hard currently to look at anything outside the blue-black deck seriously.
We have this similar, I think we have this problem. We are addressing this problem today among the formats and with that sort of in mind. It's just there's clear and present issues, and once you take care of those, it's not then clear what happens.
Yeah.
And so trying to go down the chain of like whack-a-mole the next theoretical strongest thing, just because you remove one deck, it's unclear that the next strongest deck becomes the best deck because so many decks had to fight the best deck, right? So like you spent so much real estate in your strategy to fighting Nadu or fighting Blue-Black Reanimator that I think it's a little early to say that automatically, whatever the next strongest thing was, because it might have been that next strongest thing had a good matchup, alleged good matchup against the strongest thing. Yeah. So it's just a tough one to go down the chain and take too much action. And I think, we wanted to be a little bit more conservative. This list is not that conservative, but we could have gone farther, and I think we chose the middle ground.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a point where I think with any sort of ban list, it isn't a race to the end state. Right, you get to play more different formats, the more light touch, kind of wait and see that things end up playing out. So I think in general there's this sort of appetite for, all right, if you think something's going to be a problem, get it out. But when you really internalize that something's always going to be the strongest, then that means that something is always going to appear problematic. And if you think something is the strongest, that just means part of your homework's been done for you.
Yeah. One more card that we discussed in Legacy is Orcish Bowmasters. And again, we didn't take action on Orcish Bowmasters this time, but we talked about it. What was that discussion like?
I think this was one of the more divisive conversations that we had among people who are in the building and fairly enfranchised in Legacy. It ended up sort of tie-breaking in favor of staying legal on the back of the fact that it is a card that is strong against blue decks that also sees more play outside of blue decks.
Yeah.
So these are your sort of Cradle Control lists, your Death and Taxes variants. You can just see it pop up in so many archetypes to fight against Brainstorm rather than just being a complement to it, that seeing if that remains true is worthwhile. There's also a point where this card really benefits from Psychic Frog continuing to be legal. It's going to show up a little bit less in blue decks as a result of that as well. This is a card that is really strong, and I think people like playing with Brainstorm, sort of in the same vein of the Treasure Cruise framing from earlier. This is the spot where you can play with your Brainstorms and have a good time. Bowmasters doesn't really want you to do that, which isn't in the entire spirit of the format, but in the interest of letting you play decks that aren't blue, this is a card that looks like it facilitates that in a really specific way that is so hard to hit under other circumstances.
Yeah. All right, we got one more format to discuss before we get to Q&A. So we're going to talk about Vintage, and then we're going to come back and we're going to do Q&A. I do see people are putting questions in chat. We're going to get back to those. It's going to help me if you tag @Magic. It'll help me just spot the questions as differentiated from the sort of regular chatter. But we're going to talk about Vintage first. So
At Magic, do you want to play Canlander over lunch?
I didn't bring any decks today.
Every time, I always, if I had a nickel.
Very full, but in the future, yes, absolutely.
All right, I'll see you there.
I'm here on Tuesdays. Anyway, so Vintage, Dan. Also a format that shares a lot with Canadian Highlander. Okay, I'm done.
For sure.
But we made two moves here. Moves in Vintage are not very frequent. But what prompted us to take action against Urza's Saga and Vexing Bauble?
Sure. Yeah, Urza's Saga has been around, since MH2, but really didn't start causing, I think, clear issues until after we released the Lord of the Rings set with specifically Lorien Revealed. It's been, Lorien Revealed is just a super strong card, pitches to Force of Will, helps glue together your mana base with colorless mana. The opportunity cost of playing something like Urza's Saga diminishes once you no longer have to worry about, can I play Sagas and Wastelands and cast blue spells? Like, it all becomes true. And yeah, it's in a ton of decks. I mean, it's sort of the first, the final ability is just like every card you want to start your deck with in Vintage, you can find. The middle ability allows you to make much larger constructs than in other formats because every deck has a base artifact presence. And yeah, I think it's just sort of overwhelmed the format. The most played, probably consistently winning Vintage deck is this deck called Lura's Saga, which is sort of just this like blue-black control deck. But it can play Wasteland, it can play Urza's Saga, it plays Lorien Revealed. And it just, creates a bit too much consistency. I don't think it's going to really damage necessarily any decks wholeheartedly. It's no deck's really like main strategy, but it's just got so much utility. It's among the top 5 most played unrestricted cards, and it's been that way for a while. And I'm interested to see, just how that shifts the metagame a little bit. I don't expect a ton of impact, but it's just been, just overwhelming for too long.
All right, we're going to get to questions, and again, if
you want to talk about the Vexing Bauble?
Yeah, we can.
I mean,
it's there.
It might be, The text on the Vexing Bauble and the way it's used in Vintage is really similar to a currently restricted card, Chalice of the Void, which is 0 mana, so it's probably stronger. But yeah, the ability to sort of like play out all your Moxen and Lotus, then play this, say go. Your opponent can't play, the coolest cards we've ever made for the people that like that format. Just feels wrong. I mean, if people were playing one of them or putting it in the sideboard, I think we would probably just let it ride. But a decent number of like not even artifact strategy decks have decided they want to play 2, 3, 4 copies main deck, more than just like the one you would tutor for with Urza's Saga. And at that point, I think, we want to respect, why players go to Vintage and play their sweetest cards possible. And in that vein, this I think reduces the feeling of Vintage, and so we decided to take care of it.
All right. See you later, Vexing Bauble. You only have every other format. All right. Let's do questions.
Let's go.
So, again, if you want me to spot your question, I have a bunch written down. We pulled some from online, so we've got a good stable of questions here. But I also want to, we're here because we want to talk to you. So tag @Magic, and I will try to answer or ask the questions. They're going to do the answering. I'm just here to facilitate. All right, we're going to start with, we actually did discuss this, so it's a good question, and I want to bring it up. Someone asked about, why not restrict the One Ring? It's the One Ring. It's flavorful. It makes sense here. We talked about this. What was that conversation like?
I'd say it's not completely off the table for the future. I think the way you want to think about it is when you're making a game, a decision to make a format better based on sort of like balance and removing cards. You really don't want to take into account lore. I mean, it would be flavorful. There should only be one ring. But yeah, I think that line is really tricky. Also, there's a really clear delineation among our formats where the only format that has restricted cards is Vintage. And once you pop that cap off, I think you open up a bit of a can of worms in that, why aren't we restricting? Why didn't you restrict Grief instead of ban it? Why didn't you restrict Nadu instead of ban it? Why didn't you?
There's only one Oka, Thief of Crowns. Why wasn't that a...
Yeah.
Like, he's just one guy.
Right. So it's super flavorful, and it's a cool idea, and I would say there's not like a 0% chance, but we're still looking at the One Ring. And I want to be clear, like, we will ban the One Ring if we decide it's a problem. Like, it is not immune to our decision-making process. It just hasn't been clear enough.
Yep. Fair enough. Next, there's a question I've seen a lot of versions of. Were there any unbans discussed, or did we get close to unbanning anything? You don't have to say what it is if you want to hold it in your pocket, but talk a little bit more about, I also saw a question about, okay, if we're going to have fewer BNR announcements, are we going to be more aggressive with unbannings when those come around? What are your thoughts on unbannings at this point?
The clip of unbanning has increased over the last year or so, I think, and we're still interested in that. We have conversations regarding unbans at all these moments in time where we're discussing the BNR list, and that's not going to change. This particular round, yes, we considered a couple cards. I don't want to name any because that's always a, why did you give me that kind of thing. But there's so much change in all the formats that I think introducing extra game pieces just will kind of cloud things. We want to make sure the changes we're making today push all the formats in the correct direction. And if, for heaven forbid we make a mistake in terms of what we would unban, I think the unbans we've had recently have been safe. We could just cause a whole new problem to our format. So not this time.
Yeah, I think Dan summed it up really well, where when we're already operating with pretty large error bars by pulling a bunch of pillars out of each format, it's really hard to confidently say, oh, we should also inject this card that was historically too strong at the same time, right? There's also a point where you can only unban things so many times. Like, that's not
the shadow
literally
of Golgari
true, but
Grave
for the
Troll.
most part, well, it's not just that. If you look at, so I'm really invested in legacy unbans. Like, I did a lot of work on Mind's Desire, for example, and there are only so many cards in Legacy you really can unban, so that's the sort of thing that's really exciting whenever it's not happening. But if we were to just do it every BNR, or every other BNR even, for 2 years, we would immediately be down to cards like Moxen or what have you that are just never coming off. And really, we just want to make sure that we're using that sort of thing responsibly rather than just blowing it all as fast as we can.
Makes sense. Dan, I think this is a question for you. This is from Dark Pink Hippo. Were there any bans considered for Standard?
Well, Dark Pink Hippo, we think Standard's doing great. We just experienced our first rotation in new 3-year world with Bloomburrow's release. And I think 3-year Standard's working out really well. A lot of the goals we had in mind, you can play, you can have confidence, you can play your cards for longer, are coming true. Brand new decks from new sets are being created. Cards from new sets are getting added to old strategies. I think a lot of what we want is true, and we're really happy with how Standard's looking right now. I'll note that, we talked about the BNR Cadence change. We're still going to have one window a year where we consider making bans for Standard. We didn't use the last one because we thought things were looking pretty good, and it looks like that's true, so that's how it'll work.
Right. We even did have a really big meeting about it where we went, okay, are we sure that we looked at all the sets that were coming out? Are we sure that this card's going to ride, that this card's going to ride, that people aren't going to get tired of this other card? And for the most part, it feels like people are upset they can't play more Standard. Which is a really tough time to say, oh, no, actually, we know you were liking this, but we're going to take it away from you. And I think that you both touched on it a little bit, that there are 6 times that we can ban something, but those are more like opportunities to ban a card, not in Standard, like you just said, but that doesn't mean they're always going to be used. They're just chances for us to make Magic more fun.
All right. I'm going to add I'll read this comment because it's in line with a lot of comments we've seen, questions we've seen. So we've talked a lot about the BNR announcement, but there was a companion article that Michael Majors wrote that was about how Nadu happened, how Nadu came to be, and people had thoughts on all of that. So I'll read this comment, and then I'll let, we'll start with Daniel and Carmen. The comment is just, please, and again, I've seen versions of this, please just don't change cards last minute and throw them into sets without testing. This is a flaw in your design process that needs to be fixed. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So shout out to Michael Majors, set lead for MH3, wrote a pretty clear article on where Nadu came from and why it is the way it is. Carmen and I both work on the MH3 design team, so we can sort of share our story opinion. But particularly with the question there, I think, there is a part of our process where we make, we do a last check-in. I mean, we cannot spend infinite time on all these sets and just say, well, it'll be done when it's done. There's, a schedule in terms of, when we have to be done. And I think we could tweak and make little changes forever and still maybe never get to 100% perfection. We
spent 20 minutes arguing about a toughness every day.
That's part of the game, yeah. So there's sort of just a last check-in, and I think the error we made here, as Michael highlights, is just we made a change in a way that was just not understood. We made a bit too risky of a change. As an example, something like Beseech the Mirror is a card from WoW that cost BB2 before that meeting, and now it costs BBB1. I think that was a good change. It sees decent play. Would it have been too strong? It's unclear. But these are the kind of changes that you have a little bit more confidence in. I think our error was just reacting too strongly and trying to redesign a card. Like maybe adding a mana Nadu would have been a fine way to go about what its solution would have been. But I think we were just a little too ambitious.
Yeah, I think that largely encapsulates a lot of what I was going to say. I think it is very easy to say you should push back the time that you work on cards, but that already is sort of the world that we live in.
Yeah.
You said this, but packaging it another way. There's never a day that we actually just go, you know what, actually?
Perfect, let's go.
Great stuff, guys. This is the third Modern Horizon. This is what that is. It's just there's a day where eventually we have to say, all right, guys, the editors need to work on this, and then it has to go to the factory to print the cards, to put them in the packs or what have you. And each time that we would say, okay, well, it's a little bit earlier that we don't make changes anymore, that actually is just shrinking the amount of time that we get to work on cards. Right. And it isn't really addressing the problem. Now, instead of, I'm just throwing a number, 100 days of working on the cards, we go, oh, okay, well, in the last 10 days, we won't change anything. All that is done is say we work on the cards for 90 days, and all of a sudden, we shouldn't work on cards the last 5 days, and now it's 85 and so on.
Yeah, then it becomes day 89 is a last minute change.
Yeah.
And I think Aaron Forsyth, all of your boss, tweeted something that I think is pertinent here. I mean, it's kind of pertinent to any BNR change we make, which was that you don't see the last minute changes that are effective, that do the thing. Beseech the Mirror. I didn't even know that was a last minute change to change the casting cost.
In MH3, we added a life to all of the MDFC lands. Originally, there were 2 life for a lot of development. Last second, we were like, we're really worried that these are just going to be way too strong and way too free if it is only 2 life, especially when we're seeding a deck like Life Gain with Guide of Souls and Sorin and so on that can really offset that. We think 3 life means that these can still show up and be role players. People will be excited to have them. And I think, I don't want to do the whole Obama giving self-medal meme too hard, but I think it is mostly played out that way. I think one of them hit a little bit high, but for the most part, they've been cards that you have to make a conscious decision to put into your deck. Yeah. Instead of just something that you start every single one of your deck with the 8 MDFC white lands and so on. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. I mean, we're not going to. We don't mark on the card image gallery, this was a last minute change, this was a last minute change. So it's hard to see, and it's very easy to point to that because that was what happened in this case. But yeah, it would be an interesting, this one changed last minute. We'll do that sometime when we're starved for content.
Files.
Let's see. Other questions. There was another question I saw. I lost the name and the exact question, but saw several comments and questions about waiting on Nadu. Why didn't we do an emergency ban? We saw after the Pro Tour it was very strong. Internally, we all pretty much knew at that point it would have to go. So why didn't we just pull the trigger?
Yeah, and I think you can actually answer part of this after I give my take, but we totally discussed it, and we felt very strongly as a group. I think you came on stream and just said, there's a reason we tell you when to expect change. There are a whole host of issues with, again, I use the phrase again, but opening up the can of worms of any weekend something can get banned. You lose confidence in building decks and collections and testing. I think while having specific dates isn't always perfect, I'm very interested in trying to, make those dates as, sort of poignant as possible and effective as possible instead of our current system, our previous system, But an emergency ban where we come in an unannounced weekend, we'd have an announcement of an announcement, and then there's a whole week of a dead format, and you don't even know which format it is. It kind of freezes a lot of Magic play that week. So yeah, it's just, there are pros and cons to each approach. But yes, Nadu needed banned sooner than it got banned, for sure. Sort of wrote, again, in the article, just like there were issues not only with players trying to be like, if I want to win a tournament, I need to play the best deck. The best deck is Nadu. It is very likely Wizards of the Coast will ban Nadu. We didn't say it exactly in those words, but it was pretty obvious. So I can't collect, I don't want to collect those cards because I'm gonna, only be able to use them for like a month or something like that. So there was this like freezing a moment. Like I think the data on Nadu, like if you read on various websites, isn't even like the correct number, because if people just played what they're like naturally would have played, it would have likely been so much higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are some reasons. I think we feel pretty firmly that trying to stick to dates that we tell you is important.
Yeah.
It's basically just really investing in trust.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, like the reason we do these streams in general is not, there is no script here. We are just telling you things as we believe them or as they have happened. Some of this has been a little off the script, and this transparency and us doing it or investing in it is really just us saying, hey, we really want you to trust us and know that we do care. And this is something that a lot of us got in the building because we like Canlander, because we play competitively or whatever it is. We've been there, and when we say this is when we are going to ban things, it is important that we are committing to that one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will step off the questioning stool for a second, and because I was one of the proponents of the original schedule, and I'm very strongly in favor of us sticking to our dates. And one thing that either people don't recall or don't realize because they are new or weren't paying attention to BNR at the time is we lived in that world. We lived in that world for a couple years, actually, where we were just like, we're going to ban things when we need to. But there were messaging challenges, which Dan talked to. We were announcing
It
was such a meme. But it also caused problems. We didn't want to surprise people because they were testing for tournaments. But at the same time, when we said, oh, next week we're going to have a BNR announcement, it's going to affect these formats. Those formats were dead for that week.
And for a lot of LGSs, that's like a pretty big problem, right? You put your RCQ on that weekend, no one wants to come anymore. Yeah. That's tough.
Yep. And so we heard from stores that it digitally, we saw it on Arena, we saw it on MidGo, where like people would just stop playing those formats for that week. Well, they waited with bated breath to see what happens. But they also couldn't test for the new format because they didn't know what we were going to do. So that was bad. So we also tried it where we did just do it. But then again, we surprised people like, oh, I built this deck for this event this weekend and now I can't.
No one wants to have the rug pulled on them in their hobby, right?
Yep. I think it also led us to, in some cases, internal inaction. Because we would identify a problem and we'd be like, all right, when can we do this? And part of my role as Director of Communications is like managing our communications calendar, making sure things don't run into each other. And oftentimes it'd be like, okay, we need to take action. We're going to have this meeting on this day. When can we announce it? And I'd look at the calendar. I'd be like, that's a preview. We have a Pro Tour here. We have this here. See you in 6
5 weeks.
And then we'd have other mitigating factors that would be like, well, we have the set release and we think this may change things, but we won't know. And I think not having solid dates caused some amount of indecision. Obviously, we did take action during that time, but it top to bottom didn't work, and that's why we went back to the announced dates. We do think that's better. That doesn't mean it's perfect. The change to making it match tournament seasons is a reflection of that.
Yeah, it is. We haven't done it this way, so it's unclear how much better this will be. I hope it's not worse. But as Blake mentioned, we lived in a world where that possible, doom or happiness, such an emotional weekend lied over almost every weekend, and just too much volatility. So If this ends up not being perfect, we're super happy to try something else. Part of working at this company is just trying new things all the time. And the magic has lasted for 30 years because of that.
Yeah, it's all in the details, and we're trying to be as receptive to community feedback as we can, and this is a reflection of that.
Yep. All right, let's see, we have 9 minutes. We still got a few questions we can answer. With the new BNR Cadence, are you unwilling to make changes to the current RCQ format? The only thing I will say about, I'm not sure if they meant willing or unwilling. They wrote unwilling, but that seems, anyway. The only thing I'll say about that is that these fine folks are not in charge of our play formats. So that is a good question that we can ask Billy Jensen or something like that.
Let me riff off that, because I think I've heard a version of this, and what they might be getting at is an RC format, an RCQ, RC season is only like 1 or 2 formats.
Yeah.
And so are we willing to make changes outside of those formats or to all the formats, even if the RC and RCQ that season wasn't of that format?
Yeah.
I think is what they might be getting at. And the answer is yes. We're just setting that as a sort of point in time where we can meet and gather data for those formats, but we'll still be looking at what's happening in like legacy and vintage or even standard or whatever if that's needed. So we will we will consider changes to all the formats, even if that like culmination of RC it was like modern or something.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm seeing a number of comments about the timing of the Nadu ban sucked, and that's, again, why the new timing is in place to address play. Again, for those who don't know, our previous timing for BNRs was tied to set releases. It was play agnostic. We even made the really awkward statement ahead of the last one that the BNR announcement will not affect the Pro Tour. We knew players needed to prep for that, and just the timing didn't work out because the timing did not take the Pro Tour into consideration. So it was focused on set releases. Now it's going to be focused on play timing. So if the concern is that play is not being addressed correctly, this is meant to address that. Will we get it perfectly? Maybe. I hope so. But who knows? We're going to find out. And we can, as we said, we can change.
Yeah, if this had been in place, for the last BNR, we would have had an announcement. We're a few weeks into modern RCQs right now.
Yeah.
So it would have been 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It was when this change would have gotten made, and so we would have let Nadu do what it did at the Pro Tour. I think there wasn't enough data to react to a few online events 2 weeks before the Pro Tour.
Yeah.
And it wasn't clear that it was going to be so strong.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would have won the Pro Tour still, but at least if we had shifted this 3 or 4 weeks earlier and the new world, I think modern would have been a much happier place.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely some pros to the system we'll be enacting.
Yep. Let's see. I'm going to read this statement because I think it speaks to the timing thing again. You would not need emergency BNRs if you had 12 per year. You can always say no changes. BNRs are, there's more to that statement, but BNRs are disruptive events. They pause play. They cause people to talk about just that online. They lead to a ton of speculation. What's going to happen? Boy, I don't think we want to live in a world where we have 12 of those a year.
12's a lot. I think we've seen, this is just one format and data point, but people are pretty happy about the way standards are going right now, and we reduced the number of times you have to worry about cards getting banned. I don't want to go to 0 or 1 for the older formats. I think they require a little bit more work, but yeah, I think we're unlikely to go up to 12.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's the type of thing where I understand a lot of what's being said there, but part of the desire to have these committed dates set that we could ban something is to make people feel confident in the interim.
Yeah.
And the more of those we put on the calendar, the less times they get to
confidence.
feel good.
Yep, absolutely. All right. All right, this is a question about legacy. This may be the last question, depending on how long this takes. All right, on the idea of legacy balance, since MH1, Fair Blue has gotten 8 cards banned versus 3 for the rest of the format. Ren and 6, Luris, Astrolabe, Dreadhorde, Oko, Ragavan, Iteration, Grief versus Breach, Zerta, White Plume. Fair Blue is exceptionally efficient. Is this the correct way to balance the format?
So this goes back to something that we said towards the beginning of the show, where a lot of our decisions are not necessarily chasing that pure 50-50 across the board matchup grid.
Yep.
A lot of it are trying to actually encourage the format that people want to play. Legacy is a place that a lot of people like playing Brainstorm, Days, Wasteland, Force of Will, Delver of Secrets kind of Magic. And it's really the place in Magic that they can do that and it be strong. So we end up kind of preserving some cards that would otherwise be power outliers. Brainstorm is a great example of this. It obviously is very strong, obviously is a very high win rate, but people like playing with it. So in general, we are more interested in trying to preserve what the format is about, and I swear this is not on purpose, but it's Legacy, and making sure that players know what their format is about from ban list to ban list. I think if we were to take action against something like, I don't know, Wasteland, we would have to ban 5 or 10 other cards or something at the exact same time anyway. That's at least my 2 cents. Obviously, there are a lot of people here with a lot of opinions, and not everyone's are going to align on everything, but I think this is a spot where the Legacy community is more happy with Brainstorm being legal than Dreadhorde Arcanist.
Yeah. All right. All right, one last question that I'll answer and then we'll go. So it says, why is 1 week of Magic better than 2 to 4 months of a dead format? Here's one thing I hope that gets out as we talk about this, the timing changes and everything we've discussed. Nadu is an outlier. We don't want to make all of our decisions based on what happened with Nadu, because we have not had a Nadu event for quite some time. We obviously
Everyone brings up Hogak because they remember it, but that was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It means there were 4 years
Yeah.
between when that last happened and today.
Yeah, and that's not to say obviously other cards didn't get banned or need banning in that time, but a true like format breaking 30% play outlier that was just released when it became a problem doesn't happen that often. And whereas if we change our cadence to, for example, every month, that happens all the time. The BNR announcements are constant. Nadu happened once, or it happens every 5 years, however you want to think about it. And so we often optimize for the day-to-day, the month-to-month, the year-to-year, rather than for these individual incidents. Now, whether that always works out or not is certainly a question, and we always tweak and get better. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, just on that, I think, yeah, like you said, I don't think we're going to let too many Nadus slip through the cracks. Yeah, there'll be a week probably before the December 16th ban and restricted announcement where maybe there's less interest, but that's 1 week over 4 months where, that's kind of like expected. If we have 12 of them, I think it's really tough to have constant Magic engagement. Like, we want people to be playing as much Magic as possible, right?
Yeah.
It's fun. If you think it's fun, please play. And reducing the amount of weeks in a year that is true, I think, doesn't help anybody.
Playing Magic is better than hitting refresh to see if your deck still works. Yeah. Yeah. Any last thoughts?
No, I think that mostly covers it. I know it sounds really corny. I'm really excited I'm going to Pioneer FNM this week for the first time in several months just because I get to play Cauldron Familiar again.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about that.
Yep. All right. Cool. That's it for this week. We have a bunch of cool stuff coming up because this weekend coming up is PAX West. I'm going to be there. We have a panel on Saturday afternoon for the Duskmorn debut. It's going to kick off 13 days of Duskmorn previews. We're going to introduce a ton of stuff. Hold the panel. It's going to be sweet. PAX is going to be fun. And then Weekly MTG will be back here on Tuesday following that. And we're going to talk more Duskmorn previews. Duskmorn story is happening right now. You can go read it. It's super cool and really good. Head to dailymtg.com for that. Otherwise, we will see you at PAX this weekend. That will be online as well. Or we will see you right back here next Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in.